Our story begins in the distant future. The year is 6120, and an immense spaceship is headed towards a grand interstellar adventure. But this isn't a regular space tin can. The guests can enjoy every comfort, as this will be a long voyage. There's even a huge forest inside this futuristic habitat. The artificial sky lights are dimming into a weird but relaxing sunset, and some passengers are spending some time around the campfire. A woman takes a deep breath, closes her eyes, and says, "Have you ever heard the story of Frodo Baggins and how he destroyed the One Ring?" We can't be sure if Tolkien's masterpiece will be remembered in this distant future, because more than 4,100 years have passed since The Lord of the Rings was published.
4,100 years is the same span of time that divides us from history's first grand tale, the Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's earliest surviving great work of poetry and literature. My name is Sarah. Welcome to the Mists of Time.
The saga of the rediscovery of the Epic of Gilgamesh begins in the midst of the 19th century, with a young British man named Austen Henry Layard. Henry was a member of a well-to-do family, and he spent his childhood all over Europe. In time, he began to work for his uncle Benjamin, who was quite the influential solicitor in London. After spending 6 years in his uncle's employ, Henry was getting quite weary of this tranquil urban life. He had always wanted to become an explorer, and city living did not appeal to him.
In 1839, at age 22, he decided that it was time to make a change. He had just met another English gentleman who had a similar resolve. His name was Edward Mitford, and he had hoped to reach Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka. There was just one catch: Edward's all-consuming fear of the sea. On account of this, he convinced Henry to travel across the Eurasian continent by land.
The journey was long and extremely dangerous, but it was exactly what Henry was looking for. They had to travel from London to Central Europe, then Croatia, Montenegro, Albania, Bulgaria, until they reached Constantinople. After a brief stop in that ancient city, their plan was to cross Anatolia, Syria and Palestine, then journey across the Iraqi desert and make a longer stop in Baghdad. Then they would have traveled towards Iran, Afghanistan and down to India, finally arriving in Ceylon.
Yeah, this sounds like an outrageous plan, but nevertheless, the two gentlemen made the requisite arrangements and were on their way. The tale of this great voyage, however, is a story for another day.
In 1842, the two travelers reached Iran and wandered for many months. Eventually, Henry lost his appetite for Ceylon and returned to Constantinople, where his influential connections allowed him to act as the British ambassador's aide. During his diplomatic missions, he became interested in the ruins around the Iraqi city of Mosul. They had already been partially excavated during previous archaeological expeditions, but there was clearly much more to explore.
Mr. Layard hired a local Assyrian lad named Hormuz Rassam. The two became fast friends, and together they started to excavate the ancient ruins of Mosul. Under the sands of Mosul, they discovered the lost city of Nineveh, the once capital city of Assyria, the mightiest empire of the ancient world. In Layard's own words,
hopes, long cherished, were now to be realized, or were to end in disappointment. Visions of palaces underground, of gigantic monsters, of sculptured figures and endless inscriptions floated before me. After forming plan after plan for removing the earth and extricating these treasures, I fancied myself wandering in a maze of chambers from which I could find no outlet. One particular find made during their excavations was extremely interesting. A chamber filled with inscribed clay tablets. They had stumbled upon the royal library of King Ashurbanipal. The astonishing hoard of collected writings was integral to our understanding of this historical period. Eventually, Layard went back to the United Kingdom, where he pursued a political career and left Hormuz in charge of the Mosul excavations.
Okay, just a quick note. This was at the dawn of archaeology as a field, and Layard and Rassam unfortunately had no idea what they were doing. If you ever find some ancient objects in the ground, don't touch it and call the authorities. You can't even imagine the kinds of stuff archaeologists can discover nowadays.
Layard had left the Mosul excavation in Rassam's care, but we have to remember that the goal of these expeditions was to find interesting stuff and take them to Europe. Yikes. This happened to the Nineveh Royal Library too. All the clay tablets were put in crates and shipped to London. Anyway, in the end, Rassam became a British subject and an influential diplomat for Her Majesty's government. His life is an extremely interesting one, but this too is a story for another time.
Neither of them had any idea of what the clay tablets could reveal. In fact, they were written in Akkadian, a language that wasn't completely understood at the time. The library of Ashurbanipal's contents lay in the British Museum of London for 12 years. The strange collection from a bygone age attracted quite some attention. But the most peculiar visitor was a young man named George Smith.
Born to a working-class family, George Smith enjoyed a limited education, and he was very different from the well-to-do Henry Layard. At age 14, Mr. Smith had already joined the workforce and became a banknote engraver. But his real passion was ancient Mesopotamian history. He had read every book on the subject and spent all his lunch breaks on visits to the British Museum. Hanging out at the museum and harassing academics with his many questions gave him a great opportunity, because in 1861 he became the cataloguer of the tablets collection at the British Museum. In painstaking fashion, he started to sort an incredible number of broken clay fragments. Very soon, he became an expert on the matter. But no one could predict what was going to happen.
In 1872, he found a tablet that would rock the world. One of the ancient tablets from Nineveh appeared to be the biblical story of the deluge, Noah and the Ark. In the midst of an unepochal scientific revolution, advances in geology and Darwinian evolutionary theory had begun to cast doubt on the story of Noah and the Ark. Yet, an independent account of the deluge could change everything. Was it a historical account of what really happened in the mists of time? And were other tales of the Bible historical fact too?
Mr. Smith knew this was a pivotal moment of his life. In his own words, "I'm the first man to read that after 2,000 years of oblivion." Then, it seems, he rushed out of the room in great excitement and started to undress himself. "Hey, George! Put your clothes back on, please! Yikes! Can we blur this guy, please? Thank you."
Anyway, George Smith had just discovered one of the 12 tablets that formed the standard version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. This story was the masterpiece of Mesopotamian literature, and it was recounted over and over again for thousands of years. A year later, Mr. Smith delivered a momentous presentation of his work at the Society of Biblical Archaeology. His work was considered so important that even the British Prime Minister attended the small conference.
An editor of the Daily Telegraph was so impressed by the presentation that he arranged an expedition to Iraq. And so George Smith was paid by the newspaper to carry out excavations in order to find the missing pieces of the Deluge story. Between 1872 and 1876, George Smith led 3 expeditions to Iraq, with mixed results. Sadly, in March 1876, he died of dysentery not far from Aleppo, Syria. He was just 36 years old. The uneducated kid from a working-class family had really come a long way. Next time, we'll take a deep dive into Gilgamesh's story. Subscribe and hit the bell to not miss it. See you in the next episode. Bye!